doorstep.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Porkins Policy Radio. As always, I am your host, Pierce Redmond, and you can find this podcast and every other podcast I do by going to PorkinsPolicyReview.com. Well, I am so excited about our guest for today. Today, we are going to be joined by Eva Bartlett. And for anyone that doesn't know, and I think all of my listeners definitely know who you are, but Eva is a Canadian activist and freelance journalist. She has lived in Gaza for about 3 years. Her work can be found at RT, Counterpunch, Dissident Voice, Al Akbar, and many, many other places, as well as on her amazing website, which is ingaza.wordpress.com. And Eva has just returned from, I want to say, your 4th trip to Syria. And that's what Eva is going to be talking about with us today. So, Eva Bartlett, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you, Pearson. It's good to finally be on. I know we've been meaning to do this for a while.
Yeah. For anyone out there that doesn't know, this has been like a year in the making. So I'm very excited that we could finally actually talk. And again, as I said, you just returned from Syria. And this is something that obviously Christoph Gehrman and I talk about on our podcast quite a bit. And we recently just recorded an episode dealing primarily with the war in Syria. And we were sort of mainly looking at it from a geopolitical standpoint and analysis. So we talked quite a bit about Turkey's increased intervention, the airstrikes, of course, just in the past 24 hours, 48 hours, Turkey has kind of, again, increased and gone a little bit rogue in terms of the Kurdish militias like the YPG and whatnot. We talked a lot about Russia's role in Syria, how their intervention is again changing the sort of balance of the war. But Eva, you've actually been to Syria, as I said, at least I think 4 times, and you just returned. So give us your kind of just general perspective of the war as someone that's actually been on the ground. We were just talking off air about how, much of the alternative media and even in the mainstream media, they're not really sending people to Syria. Many times, when you read the byline, they're in Beirut, or, maybe they're in Iraq or something, or they could very easily be in New York or Washington, D.C. So you've actually been there. So give us your sort of general take on what's going on in Syria. And again, where were you when you were there?
Sure. And if I may, Pierce, I'd like to preface this with just a little PSA, and that is I know that some of my detractors, who are probably many, like to say that I'm on the payroll of the Syrian government or that I only visited so-called, quote-unquote, Assad's Damascus, and neither is true. My trips to Syria have been self-funded or fundraised for, but independent of any government. So I think that's important to note. And also, on my 4 visits to Syria, I have actually been outside of Damascus. I've been to Homs 3 times, and I'll get into the chronology of that and why it's important. I've been to, within Homs, Al-Waer, where over 2,000 terrorists still remain. This was my last trip in December 2015. And the point at which I was in Al-Waer was a point where I could have been sniped if the terrorists chose to break their ceasefire. I've also been to the outskirts of Al-Yarmouk twice, and the latter time, again in December 2015, I was able to go in with Palestinian security a few hundred meters, but it was dusk, and they did not allow me to go much further because, again, at that time of night, it's difficult to protect against terrorist sniper fire. I've been to Ma'lula, which I'm sure listeners will be familiar with, an ancient Syrian village, which was occupied by different terrorist factions for 8 months. And I went there about 2 months after its liberation and was able to see not only the extensive damage to the homes and the ancient churches and Christian iconography, but also to talk with the people, the residents who had picked up arms and became National Defense Force soldiers in defending Malula, one of whom, by the way, was a priest from the St. Tekla convent whose daughter was slaughtered by these so-called Western moderates. And finally, I've also been to Latakia, which is in Syria's northwest. And it's an area that has been relatively stable. Most of the people there, it's a very diverse area, which has actually accepted and taken care of many IDPs. Perhaps it's 500,000. Between Latakia and Tartus, I'm told it's over 1 million IDPs that are being hosted there. And these IDPs are coming from areas where either terrorists have infested the areas or where they're attacking the areas. And just on another note of the IDPs, they're not only so-called Alawis. These are people of all faiths and backgrounds. But in Latakia, I also met with people who were internally displaced from the village of Kasab, which came under attack by not only Western-backed mercenaries, but also Turkey. And I met with IDPs from a village right near the Turkish border called Haram. And the stories this one particular man told me were harrowing, stories of people he knew, residents, neighbors, friends being kidnapped and their heads coming back in boxes. So, I mean, for those detractors who like to say I went in and comfortably stayed in a 4-star hotel and just reported. In fact, I stayed in the Old City on my own dollar, and I was in the Old City as much as the Syrian army and local defense forces do provide security to the extent that is possible. There are terrorists outside of Damascus that regularly shell the city with mortars and missiles, and they target civilian residential areas and schools. And on numerous occasions on my different visits when I've stayed in the Old City, I have been very close to these shells. So it's not that I have been living. I feel the need to point that out because these journalists that are reporting from Beirut or Los Angeles, that's all good. But I think that what I try to do is simply to report what I've seen and what Syrians have told me.
Absolutely. And again, even if you do go to Syria, like you said, you can be, sort of handled, and you're very much in Damascus and you're seeing whatever they want you to see there. But as you said, you're obviously going all over. I didn't realize that you were in Kasab as well. Me and Christoph talked quite a bit about that in our last podcast. Again, with the numerous Turkish, agents and spies that are working alongside many of the groups that are fighting over control of Kasab, which is very strategic. But again,
sorry, just to clarify there, Christoph, I'm sorry, Piers, I wasn't in Kasab. I was in Latakia, but there were residents of Kasab who had fled. And at that time, the village was still not secure, and they were being housed in an Armenian church in Latakia.
Okay.
And I just forgot one last place to mention, which is Sueda, which is notable because it's an area primarily Druze in the southeast of Damascus, which has from the very beginning recognized this foreign war on Syria and resisted it. But that said, Daesh and other terrorists are on the outskirts of Sueda. So while internally it's relatively safe, there is always the risk of these terrorists trying to infiltrate. And the different people of Sueda who've taken up arms to defend have been able to put off these attempts at attacks. But, the road between Sueda and Damascus was not always safe. It was known for snipings and kidnappings and landmines. And this is something the taxi driver who was driving at breakneck speed when I came back at night. I went by bus, public transport during the day, but at night there was no bus. So coming back, although it is secured, he was still being precautious and driving very fast and at the same time narrating the horrors that he had seen. So.
Well, again, Eva, give us a perspective as someone who's been there. What's the sort of general sense that you get from people actually on the ground, regular Syrians? Because they have become a sort of a nameless, faceless sort of entity. And it's very much, it's just this horrible stuff is going on. And obviously it is. But average people, what is their kind of general take on what I can only assume that from the outbreak of this quote unquote revolution in 2011, I can only assume they didn't think that this would still be going on in the state that it is now in 2016. So give us your kind of take on just what's it like for them, sort of everyday living?
Yeah, well, that would vary depending on where they're living. So, for example, in Damascus, in general, it's safer. Although I did mention the mortars that are routinely fired at Damascus, but they suffer, from want of electricity, and everybody in Syria suffers from the Western imposed sanctions, the criminal sanctions on Syria. But you take an area like, let's go to Homs. So again, I've been there 3 times. All 3 times I've been able to visit the old city of Homs. And so in April 2014, I went there with an international peace delegation, and one of the places we visited was the old city. The outskirts of the old city. We didn't actually get to the old city because at that time terrorists were still embedded in Homs. In June, when I went back independently, there was a deal which saw these different factions extracted from the old city, and I was able to talk with residents who had survived their presence, and they had endured harrowing times, but were very thankful for the liberation of the old city and for the return of the Syrian army. And again, my detractors will say this is an exaggeration, but in June, when I was in June 2014, when I was in the old city, so I met with families that had endured the presence of these terrorists, and also in the evening, in a different part of Homs, my friends stumbled across a street party, which basically was still celebrating 1 week after the presidential elections, the results of the elections. Everywhere I've gone in Syria, whether it's in Homs, Damascus, Sweda, you see photos of President Assad, and the people I've spoken with have spoken of him either affectionately, respectfully, or simply seeing him as the uniting force. But overwhelmingly, it's been affectionately and respectfully. In December, when I was there last, I went to a church choir service for Christmas, and the church was so packed because the night prior, President Assad and his wife had visited the church. And when I remarked on this to somebody I was interviewing with, they pointed out something I hadn't even considered. And that was these people not only came to the church because they hoped for a revisit by the president, but also they did so at personal risk because the church is roughly a kilometer from Jobar and from outlying areas where there are terrorist factions. And very possibly they could have chosen to punish the people for their great support of the president and send rockets and missiles their way. And this is something they did do on voting day in June 2014 when Syrians braved terrorist mortars and missiles in some of the heaviest influx of these attacks on polling stations and especially on Damascus. The terrorists were trying to prevent Syrians from exercising their right to vote. Back to other places I've visited, I went to Al Zahra, which has been subject to many terrorist suicide and car bombings. And the people there, again, they're staunchly, and they're not only Alawi, that must be said, they also incorporate IDPs who are Christian and Sunni. And they're staunchly pro-government, pro-Syrian army. They're very proud of their government and their army. So this is a narrative that I've seen personally all over Syria where I've visited. And it's a narrative that comes from areas, for example, in Aleppo, where I have friends that are living there. And they tell me, look, the way the media is portraying things, they're saying that the Syrian army is besieging innocent civilians. But the way they see it, these civilians that are living in Aleppo are saying, no, the Syrian army is besieging terrorists who are now fleeing for the Turkish border because with the liberation of certain areas in Aleppo, these terrorists, their supply lines have been cut off. So, I mean, it's a starkly different narrative than we're going to hear in the corporate media.
Oh, absolutely. And just to point out, I woke up this morning and I was, reading a bunch of stuff, and a big article in Al Monitor talking about, the battle in Aleppo is, raging on. After the peace talks, quote unquote, in Geneva have been suspended. But Eva, it's interesting. You were saying, and there are so many detractors, and believe me, I get, me and Christoph get accused of being Russian agents, of being Chinese agents, whatever. The detractors are everywhere. But it's interesting because. They're saying, well, you're just supporting the Assad and the Syrian army. But, curiously, they never really mention, well, but who is the good, who should Eva Bartlett really be supporting? Because it seems as if the moderate rebels and this mysterious, amorphous opposition have almost completely disappeared definitely from the media narrative, and most likely from the sort of on the ground actual narrative. It seems as if, the FSA rarely gets mentioned at all. The moderate rebels, we've already seen groups like Division 30, which the Pentagon and CIA spent millions and millions and millions of dollars on, and they were only able to actually churn out like 10 recruits. And then, of course, the second they were sort of let loose in Syria, they went and gave, I believe they surrendered to al-Nusra.
Right.
In that place, in that void, it's basically a disparate group of terrorist groups and gangs. We have ISIS, al-Nusra, as I said, Arha al-Sham. There's a ton of different, there are Chechen factions, there are, Uyghur groups, all sorts of things. And the opposition, political opposition, seems to basically consist of Saudi Arabia and these sort of front groups that that they're trying to sort of put forth for the Geneva talks. So I'd just love to get your kind of take on that. Where has the moderate rebels, the opposition, the FSA, where have they gone? Because they just seem to sort of have disappeared, and in its place are these horrible groups, and it's sort of like, so that's the alternative to Assad?
Yeah, I would argue that moderate so-called rebels, neither of those ever existed.
Right.
None have ever been moderate, and they're not rebels. Many of them are mercenaries. Others, for whatever reason, have taken up arms. They're getting paid, or they've been bullied into it for fear of their life in areas where Daesh and other terrorists are. But I'm of the opinion that the reason the media doesn't talk about al-Nusra or Jaish al-Islam or Jaish al-Fatah or any of these other equally terroristic factions is that, ISIS or Daesh is the convenient boogeyman. It's what can be used as a tool by the West to say we must intervene and save, the civilians of Syria. Whereas, we know from declassified documents, like there was a document that was from 2012 that was released that stated the West knew that by supporting, Saudi-backed, Wahhabi so-called Islamic terrorists, that they would be able to influence change in Syria. I'm paraphrasing, but they knew, and from even further back, this has all been orchestrated. They knew that a way to destabilize Syria was to support these radicals, these Wahhabi or Muslim Brotherhood radicals. But I think that, if you look, and I don't look at the mainstream media because it's too painful, but I'm aware of some of their lies. And if you look at it, aside from the lies against the Syrian government and army, you'll see that that the main thing is to say, we must stop Daesh, we must stop ISIS. Well, you must stop all of these terrorists, and the Syrian government has laid out plans, from the very beginning on how to do so, and that was to stop, these Wahhabi sheikhs from their hate speeching, stop the funding coming from Saudi Arabia and Qatar, close the borders with Turkey, stop allowing so-called Israel to aid and treat terrorists and shuttle them back in. On many occasions, the Syrian army has confiscated weapons, munitions, and supplies that have come from Israel and America. But yeah, back to your question about the moderates and the point about Geneva. So the Syrian government has been willing to dialogue with internal opposition and opposition that are not supporting terrorists. And who was put forth at Geneva but Jaish al-Islam and Ahrar al-Sham?
Yes.
And these are Saudi-backed terrorists. These are terrorists that are, partaking in the firing of missiles and mortars on civilian areas. These are terrorists that took civilians and put them in cages in Douma. And then the Western media did not condemn those acts. They instead condemned the Syrian army, which is fighting these terrorists. And they condemned the Syrian army because, oh, look, you're fighting these terrorists in areas where moderate rebels have put them in cages. It's beyond credibility.
No, I know. When I saw that that's who Saudi Arabia had sort of put forth, it's so transparent. It's just like right in your face. They're not even. I guess that's what just surprises me is, in other areas of the Middle East that were affected by the Arab Spring, there was at least a facade of, this is a democratic group. Don't look too deeply into the National Endowment for Democracy or all these other CIA front groups that are funding them. But there was a modicum of oh, this is about democracy. Whereas right now you're saying that, the Saudi Arabia is just putting forth as the opposition that, oh, well, they need to be at the negotiating table, are just straight terrorists, people that, as you said, they were putting Alawis in cages and parading them around in the hopes that, oh, well, no one will attack us now. There was one of the I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but a big quote unquote moderate rebel general in the FSA who was talking about going and slaughtering all the Shia and Christian, particularly in the south of the country. So yeah, very, very. I don't know. I guess it just strikes me as so bizarre that it's just sort of come to this. That this is sort of the fight. It's basically the terrorists versus the Syrian army. But there's another kind of aspect to this, and again with the sort of media lies and whatnot. And we saw this, I think it was a year or so back, with the sort of horror that was going on within Yarmouk. And I know that you said that you were there as well, Eva. And explain a little bit about not only what Yarmouk is, but what's going on there, and then basically how it just completely disappeared from the media narrative. And then suddenly, in the past month or so, it was Madaya. This was the new sort of focal point of our attention. This horrific siege, people are starving and whatnot. And I know you've said in interviews and in articles that Madaya became the new Yarmouk. And this is just, again, one of these sort of, once a week, oh, we all have to care about an area, like this on Facebook, and that'll solve the problem. So explain a little bit, what is Yarmouk, what's going on in Yarmouk, and how it basically disappeared and how Madaya took its place.
Yeah, so Yarmouk is a district of Damascus that the corporate media will say it's a Palestinian refugee camp, but Syrian residents and Palestinian residents of Yarmouk, now it used to number over 1 million Syrian residents, and estimates differ between 150,000 to 170,000 Palestinian residents. But those people would not call it a camp. It was a district. But it's convenient to call it a camp because that immediately paints this image in readers' minds of what Palestinian camps elsewhere are like, for example, in Lebanon and Jordan. And they are squalid and awful places to live where Palestinians truly suffer. In Syria, Palestinians have the same rights as Syrians with the exception of voting, but they're allowed to have professional jobs. They get the same free medical and healthcare and free medical and education that Syrians get. And in Yarmouk, the people that I've met who, displaced Palestinians and Syrians who are now being housed in either UN or governmental centers, told me the problem is not the Syrian government. I mean, of course, you'll have your detractors, but the vast majority said the problem is not the government. The problem is that in 2012, terrorist factions, Nusra, and now it's Daesh, infiltrated into Yarmouk and took over vast areas. And the people of Yarmouk did not, of course, there were, again, some collaborators, unfortunately, but the vast majority of people did not want them there. Yarmouk is strategic because, if the terrorists had been able to take over Yarmouk, then it puts them that much closer to the heart of Damascus. But so now, when I was there last, I talked with a Palestinian representative of security in Yarmouk, and he's with the PFLP General Coordinating Committee. And he and also other journalists I've seen later, their reports, say that now there's no more than, say, 5,000 or 6,000 civilians in Yarmouk. The reason being, over the years, the government has facilitated evacuations of civilians from Yarmouk at the same time as enabling Palestinian security forces to fight the terrorists in Yarmouk. The government has also allowed and facilitated aid into Yarmouk. And even, I believe it was Sky News, I'd have to go through my notes, but there was a British reporter, and he, in 2013 or 14, had video footage of being in Yarmouk and being with, say, a large group of residents that were protesting the presence of the terrorist and that came under fire from the terrorist. And he himself was running, you could see the footage of him running along with people as the shots rang out. The Red Crescent, which also delivers aid into Yarmouk, has repeatedly come under fire from terrorists. So the basic narrative that the Western media like to say is the Syrian government is starving the people of Yarmouk. The Syrian government is depriving aid into Yarmouk. But the reality of what residents of Yarmouk had to say, and also independent reporters, be they be they Syrian reporters or even, the odd Western reporter, have said is no, in fact, the reality is that certain areas, like 75% now of Yarmouk, is still held by terrorists, and aid that goes in is often or routinely taken by terrorists. And now this is where you have a parallel with Madaya, because that's what's happened in Madaya. In Madaya, you have Western media reporting 40,000 civilians. I've seen disputed numbers on how many civilians live there, but the point being that Madaya is infested by at least 600 terrorists of different factions, including the Geneva representatives Ahrar al-Sham, al-Nusra, and the so-called Free Syrian Army. And you had a Red Cross spokesperson saying on October 18th they'd send in enough food to last for 2 months. And you had the UN apparently going in at the end of December to evacuate some of the wounded terrorists. And at the same time, you didn't see any headlines of people starving in Yarmouk or in Madaya. But suddenly in I think it was mid-January, you had a furor of media suddenly blaming the Syrian army and the Syrian government and saying they're starving the civilians of Madaya. Well, aid went into Madaya on January 11th, and one of the journalists that went in to talk with civilians, there were different journalists, some Lebanese media like Al Mayadeen, but Russia Today's journalist Murad Gazdiev went in, and he was talking with residents, and the narrative he was getting was the terrorist factions in Madaya had taken whatever food was entering Madaya and were selling it at ridiculous rates they couldn't afford. And indeed, when you see photos of these different factions in Madaya, they are pretty well fed. They're not starving.
Yeah.
Also, when Al Mayadeen, it was either Mayadeen or Manar went in, and they did interviews with residents, and they got the same thing. They got the same residents saying, the problem is the terrorists. They're stealing our food. They're killing our people. And there were even video footage of demonstrations against them saying, we don't want you here, get out. But that is not the narrative put forth by the corporate media. And in fact, not only did the corporate media and the UN and aid agencies overlook intentionally the reality in Madaya, but they also blatantly lied, and they recycled images, some purportedly from Yarmouk, although I even wonder if those were recycled from elsewhere, and other images from all around the world, from Britain, from Africa, from South Lebanon. And these images were used to, again, send a message to Western readers or TV viewers or whatever who just tune in for their soundbite of information that once again the big bad boogeyman Syrian government is killing civilians, when in fact these images were not even portraying the reality in Madaya.
Oh yeah, and again, I mean, there's I guess it's now become a sort of a famous or infamous picture of a small girl in I think in Lebanon. Who was used as a sort of poster child for what was going on in Madaya, and her family was, protested and said, "Oh, but she's totally fine." I saw a picture of a migrant in Europe starving. That was used, as this is what's going on in Madaya. So yeah, I mean, obviously, and again, there's like next to no sort of retraction in the media when that happens. If people can go back far enough, they might remember the BBC altering video footage that they had of a Red Cross worker, I believe it was, who was saying that they were getting they were being shelled, and then the BBC went in and altered the audio and said, "Oh, we were getting gassed," and they got caught, and they sort of, "Oh, whoops," I don't know how that happened.
The BBC did that also with some purported British doctor who I can't remember her name, but there's Robert Stewart has done a lot of wonderful investigation into the BBC's manipulations and lies. I highly recommend looking him up. He's on Facebook, and he's got a blog. A Panorama on BBC or something like that. But in that investigation, they altered the audio of someone who was either a doctor or posing to be a doctor during the alleged chemical weapons attacks.
Yes.
When they were blaming the Syrian army, when it turned out to be the terrorist rebels supported by Saudi, Qatar, and Turkey. And the woman first said, this looks like, and I can't remember what she said, mustard gas or something. And then the audio was edited to say chemical weapons. But anyway, there was manipulation there. There's also the famous photograph of an Italian photographer whose photograph I believe was from Iraq, and it showed a bunch of corpses wrapped in shrouds. And the BBC purported that this was, again, in Ghouta or somewhere in Syria. And the photographer came out and said, "That's my photo, you're lying." Now with Madaya, there was all this media frenzy. I haven't heard much lately, although I think it has been used in the Geneva talks, again, to blame the Syrian government, although, the Syrian government can quote the Red Cross spokesperson as saying, "No, we sent food in. There should be no starvation." But I did just notice on February 9th, a group of aid workers from the Red Cross and the Syrian Red Crescent were trying to evacuate 3 urgent cases, and they came under fire from these terrorists. So, the shenanigans of these mercenaries continue, but now that it's not convenient, Madaya seems to be dropping out from the spotlight.
Oh yeah, exactly. Just as Yarmouk did.
Right.
They're just Palestinians who really, they're great for PR for a moment, and then you can just forget about them. The same with Madaya or any of these regions. And again, I know it can be kind of dicey when you are saying that this isn't quite the reality of what's going on, and again, they very well there could be people. I mean, there are people starving in Madaya, but it's sort of an issue of who's controlling that starvation
precisely.
And I know again that can be a very uncomfortable topic to, and also just say I've had experience with that, talking about the Rwandan genocide, where you get into yes, those people were killed, but maybe it wasn't the perpetrators of that were a different group. Maybe it was really actually the Tutsis killing other Tutsis and Hutu. So, without getting too sidetracked on that. So, yeah, but it is important, I think, to expose that, to at least talk about it. And this is, maybe me being very cynical. But, I saw a lot of these reports of, government or Hezbollah forces, not letting food in or things like that. And this is just, again, very cynical. But what do you expect? It's a war. These same people that were advocating for the overthrow of Assad, and then when they see the realities of what war looks like, where again, all sides do horrible things in a war. I mean, that's just by its very nature. You're killing people. So it's sort of this element of, well, what did you expect? Yeah, of course, people are going to be starving. All sides are going to do extreme measures if they feel it's in their best interest or that it's going to advance their own position. So, it's sort of grow a pair. This is what you wanted. This is what you're getting. So, right. I mean, that's a very cynical sort of view.
Well, no, it's practical and it's realistic. I mean, some of my colleagues have articulated it better than I will, but essentially my understanding is that when there's a presence of terrorists, infesting an area, and from that area, either depriving the civilians of goods that are needed to live, or also additionally firing their dirty, hell cannons and mortars and missiles onto civilian areas outside, then obviously the government, the army, is going to do something to stop that terrorism. And siege is apparently one of the most effective tactics. Putting siege on the area, enabling the evacuation of civilians, and then working to either get the terrorists to lay down their arms, as we saw with Homs, and evacuate the area, or fighting it in, unfortunately, a way that people are going to die. But this is war, and you compare it with what does the West do? What has the West done in its various bloody wars throughout the decades? They carpet bomb areas. I mean, it's one of the main hypocrisies of people who dare to talk about this and condemn the Syrian army and allies for fighting for their lives and fighting against this terrorism that the West has brought them. And at the same time, do they condemn the U.S. for, carpet bombing Iraq or Afghanistan or Vietnam? There's no comparison in that sense.
No, absolutely. And on this sort of the same note, and again, the hypocrites out there, there is, of course, Molly Crabapple, who is, she just defines hypocrite and shill, and I'm sure all my listeners are familiar with her. She's, done stuff for Vice and all of the cool sort of hipster propaganda outlets. And she recently doxed a UN press official. I won't say what her name is because she's already I think she's lost her job, and her family has been exposed. It's horrible when you dox somebody. But, Molly Crabapple didn't like the fact that she was on her own personal Twitter account, according to Crabapple, cheering the Russians and Hezbollah and stuff. But Crabapple basically went so far as to say that the UN was sort of collaborating with Assad in order to, obfuscate what was going on in Madaya. And that really, the UN, loves Assad, according to Molly Crabapple. And this is just so laughable. The notion that they would be working together, because let's just face it, the UN, generally speaking, is not all that friendly or favorable to the Syrian government. So I think by, the fact that the UN was maybe sort of downplaying or Madaya in Crabapple's mind, maybe does show that the situation there was quite different. Obviously, the UN doesn't care about lying. But Eva, we were talking off air sort of about this and the UN downplaying certain areas. So what's your take on that?
Absolutely. So with respect to the timeline of Madaya, my understanding is that it came under siege due to the presence of the terrorist within it around July or August 2015. But take the villages of Fu and Kafaria, which are just north of Idlib in Syria's northwest. They've been under siege, like partial siege, for the last 4 years. They've been under full lockdown since March 2015. And so when I was looking, I've written a couple of times about these villages and the suffering that they are enduring, which includes not only a severe lack of food and medical supplies, but also lack of fuel to run generators and keep warm in the winter and pump water. And in addition to that, they are being assaulted by the attacks of terrorists, of mercenaries surrounding them, which hammer them with missiles, hell cannons, any sort of dirty mortar they can contrive. But this is not reported in the corporate media. Usually, if they mention them at all, it's just those two Shiite villages in the north. And the UN also is complicit because when I was writing I was looking into the UN's portrayal of Madaya versus Fua Kafaria and other areas. And what I found was if you took the OCHA, which is the humanitarian branch of the UN, and looked at their Twitter feed, while I found that a UN spokesperson had in March 2015 expressed quote unquote grave concern about the area of Idlib and the fighting going on there, which I would have to assume had to apply especially to Fu and Kafaria. Since that March 2015 mention of grave concern, they did not mention by name Fua Kafaria until December 28th. So that's a number of months later, a lot of terrorism later, yet those villages did not merit mention. What areas did merit mention were Al-Zabadani, which is terrorist infested, Al-Yarmouk, terrorist infested, Al-War, terrorist infested, Al-Madaya, terrorist infested. And then I looked at their first express mention of Fu and Kafaria, and I'd have to look at my notes, but it was in January when the Madaya campaign ramped up. And when they mentioned Fu and Kafaria, this is the UN I'm referring to by they, I compared it from their, I think, let me just check my notes here. It was like the December 28th, I believe, from December 28th, I was right. That's when OCHA I first found, and I went meticulously a few times over the OCHA Twitter feed just to be sure. They didn't mention Fu and Kafaria until December 28th, and then until the date when I wrote this, January 14th, they mentioned Madaya 17 times and Fu and Kafaria 6 times, although Fu and Kafaria have been under siege for years and full siege for many months longer than Madaya and for different reasons, and are suffering, in addition, again, to the starvation and lack of supplies, they're suffering the terrorism. They still didn't mention these villages, and my belief is because it doesn't serve their agenda. With respect to Yarmouk, the UN is complicit again in distorting reality on Yarmouk. And there's a famous photo which shows, a human, tidal wave of people. And the UN put this forth as people waiting for food. But I'm told by a very credible journalist that, in fact, this was one of many occasions, when people were enabled to evacuate from Yarmouk. And these people were not lined up for food, they were lined up to evacuate.
Oh yeah, absolutely. No. Yeah, I've read the exact same reports, and people will know it is this very shocking photo of, I mean, just thousands of people sort of streaming out. But yeah, again, just to reiterate that the UN certainly is not collaborating with Assad, and anyone putting forth these sort of ideas, or again, that's just classic propaganda, or also just a matter that there are people that work at the UN that probably that fully do support Assad, or do think that the Russian air campaign is justified. Again, I would never sort of support an intervention, but the Russians were invited there by Assad, who is the legitimate leader of Syria, unlike the Turks or the Americans or any of the other groups that are bombing targets, that are sending in drones, that are sending in fighters. So that's a reality that we should sort of understand.
Yeah, and with respect to individuals within the UN, obviously not all individuals are anti-Syria, and that's a good point. But I met with the Syrian ambassador to the UN in New York City, Dr. Bashar al-Jafri, in early 2015, and when I spoke with him, he spoke of the different things that have happened to the Syrian representative at the United Nations, the sole voice that should be allowed to have the floor, and what have happened by the UN. And these are not accidental things, that on numerous occasions, either his microphone has been cut or the video feed has been cut. Or in other instances, I remember one where there was the issue was discussing terrorism in Syria and Iraq. He and the Iraqi representative were given something like 4 minutes to talk, and then the floor was given to Western officials. I mean, the litany of UN shenanigans against he and Walid Mu'allim and other Syrian representatives would totally refute any sort of accusation that the UN is supporting or working with the Syrian government. I found an interesting thing, by the way. The woman that Crabapple outed, she actually referred to me at one point. Somebody had mentioned it to me, and she said something like, I asked the question, why is a young woman like Molly Crabapple chosen to write about Syria and not somebody like Eva Bartlett? And she kind of mentioned the fact that I had a history of activism in Gaza, and had been to Syria independently. So I suppose that's another reason why Crabapple would have an issue with this woman.
Oh yeah, and just to pile on Crabapple, who I can't stand. This is, of course, the same journalist in air quotes that promoted Weave, the racist white nationalist hacker. And then claimed, I didn't know he was racist. And we've actually countered that by saying, you knew exactly who, all of my racial political views were exposed in the courtroom where you were sitting drawing, these stupid portraits of me. So, you definitely knew what was going on. And there was recently a listener of mine tweeted out a picture to me of, I think it was like Weave's after party when he won his court case. And he's there doing a Heil Hitler salute. So he definitely wasn't hiding his white nationalist viewpoints. And this is, again, someone that Crabapple and Vice, promoted and then sort of pretended that, no, sorry. But again, very much part of this clique of hipster media propagandists.
Yes.
That have this unsettling, lean towards the neoconservative movement. And some of them, I'm not even sure if they're really aware that they're promoting these sort of sick and twisted ideas. But moving on a little bit and kind of shifting gears, I just wanted to get your take on one particular aspect of the war in Syria. And this is something that I think, Eva, we talked about in emails probably a year back when we were talking about recording something. And that is the Israeli involvement. And I know, my listeners are definitely aware of my stance on this. I do think that there's a little bit too much, in the alt media, it's always the Zionists or the Jews are behind everything. But I think it really strikes me as odd that ISIS almost never mentions Israel, or the Palestinians for that matter. And again, this is sort of like Islamic terrorism 101. you have to, Israel has to be kind of part of your overall agenda. This is something that Al-Qaeda definitely harped on about quite a bit. So I was always amazed that ISIS never mentions them at all. And then we do get these sort of odd reports here and there of terrorists being taken into the Golan Heights, going to Israeli hospitals and then coming back in. And again, and Israel seems fairly quiet on ISIS as well. I think there was even, I think it was the foreign minister in Israel had some wild statement where he said something to the effect of, well, we'd rather work with ISIS than Iran or something like that. So what is your sense of Israeli involvement, or at least a possible angle that they have in terms of the Syrian war? And again, speaking as someone who has lived in Gaza, has traveled in Palestine, you have an interesting perspective on it.
Well, yeah, I mean, it has been documented that so-called Israeli leadership has supported terrorists. You've seen photos of Netanyahu in hospitals, giving his condolences to wounded terrorists who are being treated in Israeli hospitals. And even the UN's UN disengagement observer forces who were stationed in the occupied Golan, they have documented the interaction between Israeli soldiers and terrorists. They've documented it. They've reported this to the higher bodies of the UN, and nothing has been done. And recently I did see a statement. I was just going to look for it, but something, Syrian so-called rebel leader meets with Israeli deputy minister in the Knesset. I mean, when you think about how who is benefiting from all this bloodshed and chaos in Syria, Israel is certainly one of the prime benefactories, because Syria has been long an advocate and very strong supporter of Palestinian resistance and right of return and Palestinian sovereignty. And Israel certainly would be happy if Syria wasn't able to continue that resistance. And I think, getting back to Yarmouk, that was another element to the whole media lies on Yarmouk, because, just to sidetrack for a second, among the defenders of Yarmouk and other parts of Syria are various Palestinian factions that are fighting alongside the Syrian Arab Army. But yeah, I mean, with Israel, like, as we were saying earlier, ISIS or Daesh is this boogeyman group that is used to instill fear in the average Westerners who think they're going, to steal our freedoms as previous terrorist groups before them.
Come over from Mexico.
But, why hasn't, I mean, if these are supposedly, and they're not, but if they're supposedly radical Muslims, why haven't they attacked Israel, who would be the prime target? Why, in fact, are they, whether they're ISIS or Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda in Syria, why are they actually working with Israel and abetted by Israel? And why do Israeli weapons routinely turn up in Syria? Just the other day, Syrian forces confiscated Israeli weapons and landmines in Sueda province. So I think it's pretty clear. I mean, we know about the collaboration between Saudi Arabia, Qatar, NATO, Turkey, and these terrorists. And Israel has been actually very open in its support for terrorists in Syria, because they would love to see Syria destabilized. They would love to see a break in the axis of resistance.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, like you said, ISIS is, what even is ISIS? Anyone can say that they're part of Daesh or, whatever, the artist formerly known as ISIL. It can be anybody. But again, too, it is interesting that, never speak about Israel, never try to bomb a target. And when we do see them overseas bombing things, it's almost always in places like Dagestan or Chechnya. I think there was just a bombing this morning in Dagestan that, again, is being linked to ISIS. Who knows, again, we could set off a bomb and ISIS could take credit for it. So, it's very easy to do that. But Eva, kind of rounding out this conversation, we've been talking, these are pretty heavy kind of topics, and I love your blog, again, ingaza.wordpress.com, because you do also talk about positive things, and you do talk about the solidarity movement, about activism and things like that. And there are, in fact, some reasonable actors within Syria. And I know you've spoken about the Grand Mufti, as well as President Assad's media advisor. And you sort of talked about them in the context of this. These are sort of definitely the Grand Mufti is like a real opposition figure in that he, is trying, to look for peace. There are some positive people that could have influence within the geopolitical landscape within Syria. So maybe just talk about that a little bit, kind of leave us on a more positive note.
Yeah, well, the Syrian, the Grand Mufti, Mufti Hassoun, is the highest Muslim religious authority in Syria, and he's one of the most secular Syrians I've met. He regularly, I've seen him a couple of times, and each time with Bishop Al-Khoury. Bishop Al-Khoury, yes. And, he talks about him as his brother, his cousin. He talks about himself as the representative or the Mufti of Syrians, not of Muslims. And he really does both emanate secular Syria, kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Secularism in Syria, and also great forgiveness. I mean, his own son was assassinated at the hands of terrorists who were acting on Gulf orders, and the Mufti forgave the assassins and really used it as an occasion to say, Syria, please come back. Syrians who have taken up arms, come back to Syria. And to really highlight the fact that what Syria is fighting is not an inter-Syrian conflict. It's a conflict from, thrust upon Syria from outside. And Dr. Shaban also, she is Muslim, but, obviously just like any Syrian that I've met, whatever their faith is, they've always stressed to me, and this is again Syrians that I've met who are not in terrorist areas and have not the warped Muslim Brotherhood ideology or Takfiri ideology, but she and they have said, I'm Syrian and then it's my faith, but we don't even discuss what one another's faiths are. But everybody I've talked with, and again, let's refer to Fu and Kafadia, which I mentioned in the media, are just relegated to two Shiite villages. Well, the people from those villages, I have friends that are from those villages, and they made a point of stressing to me that they have always celebrated one another's faiths, and there have been intermarriages. And when I was in Damascus, one of my good friends, he happens to be Shia, and his wife is Sunni. Or vice versa, I forget which. Vice versa, she's Shia, he's Sunni. But the point is that the secularism was what Syrians are proud of, and none of this sectarianism is inherent to Syria. And, so the Mufti, it's interesting, he should be somebody that people have on interviews. He should be somebody that if the West was actually interested in peace and hearing a peaceful solution and peaceful voice and talking about tolerance in Syria, the Mufti Hassoun is the prime candidate to talk about this, because that is his message consistently. And also Dr. Shaban. But they have been ostracized by the media because obviously with the war agenda on Syria, they don't want to hear these peaceful voices. They'd rather take some Saudi-backed representative and doll him up in a suit and tie and say that this represents the Syrian people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and again, I mean, you've written about Mufti Hassoun. He's denied visas. He's he's been invited many times, I believe, to the U.S., to Europe to speak, but he can't get a visa. Whereas I believe the sort of head patriarch of the Christian faith in Syria has been able to travel abroad. And again, obviously, there's this sort of weird, everyone in the U.S. sort of loves the idea of the Syrian Christians or loves to use them as, they're being oppressed. But they sort of obviously leave out the fact that most of them are pretty favorable to Assad, that they have lived more or less in peace alongside Shia, Sunni, Druze, all sorts of secular people. But that kind of gets lost in translation. And again, just to rounding it all out, I think it's important just to note that Syria is this really very different from the rest of the Arab world. It is a very cosmopolitan sort of a country. It is it was hopefully the last secular Arab nation around, and there was a multiculturalism. Interreligious marriages were very common. We had these ancient places too, like the ancient Christian villages. I mean, it's just an amazing place, and it's so depressing to see it sort of turn into basically just rubble everywhere. But Eva, any kind of last quick thoughts on Syria, on what we've been talking about? Anything you want to kind of leave the listeners with?
Yeah, well, what you were saying about Mufti Hassoun not being granted visas, I mean, he's been flat out told that he's unwelcome in the United States. And when I met with him, he asked Bishop Khoury if they gave you a visa, how long would they give you? And Bishop Khoury said 5 years, and this would be based on his experience. But you have, for example, President Assad may be Alawi, but his wife is Sunni. And you see him repeatedly visiting Christian areas and being welcomed in Christian areas, like Ma'lula. Mufti Hassoun himself, a Muslim, has led a Christmas service in Ma'lula, which is, one of the oldest Christian areas in the world. And yeah, I mean, I think as a parting message, it would be that again and again, whenever I've dared to breach the subject, and I don't because, I wouldn't rather because it's disrespectful to Syrians, but I have in terms of being able to refute what the corporate media has to say and refute this sectarianism that is projected on Syria. When I've asked people about, and I should note that I speak broken but moderate colloquial Arabic, so I'm not asking by way of translator in most cases. I'm talking directly with the person and getting their answers. There's no distortion by government sources if that's what people wanted to believe. But I ask them some of the basics, like about their faith, and they say I'm Syrian, and you prod and they say I'm Syrian, and finally they'll tell you, okay, I'm Christian, but it doesn't matter because I go to mosque and my Muslim brothers go to church with me. Or you ask them. One of the things I did in my first 2 visits was to just ask simple questions. What's happening in Syria? Is this a so-called revolution? Every person I met said, no, this is not a revolution. This is, and they, some people were more nuanced than others, said this is a foreign war in Syria, and they could articulate exactly the players involved. I would ask people, from university students to taxi drivers to people I met in markets, whatever, what is the solution to Syria? And their answer is stop funding and sending terrorists into Syria. Allow the Syrian people to choose their own destiny. And they have chosen their own destiny. It's just the West hypocritically keeps saying, no, obviously the Syrian people don't know what they want. We're going to have to decide for them. So the message would be, especially to people who really think and buy into this narrative that the Syrian people don't want Assad, the Syrian people are being massacred by Assad, why then has the Syrian army so many recruits from all different faiths? Why do you repeatedly see, especially in areas, for example, like recently Al-Nubal and Zahra, which were under terrorist siege for over 3 years and recently liberated by the Syrian army and allies, why do you see images and videos of them singing and praising the army and praising the government? Because the truth is, the vast majority of Syrians do support and even love their government and certainly their army. And they see their army and allies as the only ones who are fighting terrorism in Syria. So this very arrogant Western narrative that we have to do something, that the West's coalition to attack ISIS is doing something. This is an arrogant and Western narrative, and it's a narrative that was used again in Libya and Iraq before, and we've seen what Western so-called intervention has done to those countries. So I think that, I would highly suggest that people start listening to Syrian reporters on the ground who are risking their lives. And there's a number of good English-speaking Syrian reporters who are reporting from the hotspots and actually showing, doing interviews with the people who have been under siege or locked down by these terrorists. And you can hear what the Syrian people want, whether they're in Madaya or besieged Fud Qafaria or in Damascus, which is, more calm in those areas. And in Damascus, I've been to an Easter party in April 2014, and I mention this because it's not all death and destruction in Syria. Syrians are persistent and defiant. You've perhaps seen photos, even the Western press has picked up some photos from old Homs. And it started with one Syrian photographer who did a photo shoot of a young couple who got married amidst the rubble in Homs. And this is a message to say life goes on and we will continue to fight and we will rebuild. And this is a message that Syrians have given me each time I've visited there.
Absolutely. And just to put a period to that, even Zbigniew Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger, deep state agents and war criminals, even they admit that, the people of Syria have made their decision and Assad has way more support, and that this is kind of a ridiculous exercise. It's a war, and that you're never going to win it. But anyway,
Yeah.
Eva Bartlett, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. I'm so glad that we finally got to talk, and I hope that I can have you back on again soon. But quickly, please, tell the listeners where they can go to read all of your work.
Well, as you mentioned at the beginning, I do write for different publications, but I always republish them on my blog, which is ingaza.wordpress.com. And just for the sake of ease, because the blog was initially about what I was witnessing in Gaza over the years, but I decided to keep the blog because I feel it's important actually to draw people who are supportive of the Palestinian cause but confused on Syria. That's one of the reasons I decided to keep the blog as it is in Gaza. So for that reason, just to make it easier, I did make a page just titled Syria, but there's a drop-down menu, and it has links to different pages of my different writings and blog posts in and from Syria, and different video and audio clips I've done with Syrians and other things related.
Excellent. So, and I definitely encourage everyone to go and check out Eva's blog. I'll say one of the coolest things ever was seeing my website on your blog roll. And of course, everyone can find Eva's blog on my blog roll as well. So, Eva Bartlett, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Pierce. It was fun.
Okay, so that was our conversation with Eva Bartlett. And again, I would definitely encourage all of the listeners to go and check out her work at ingaza.wordpress.com. Well, I just have a few quick little announcements to make at the end of this podcast, and the first of them is to say that, of course, the Kickstarter for Newsbud is up and running right now. We've got about, I believe it's 53 days left in the whole campaign, and we are doing quite well right now, but of course we do need all of your support. So if you enjoy this podcast, if you like the work that I do, then please go to the Kickstarter page. You can find that linked up on boilingfrogspost.com. You can also find it on my website. And you can also just Google, Kickstarter, Newsbud. You can go to Kickstarter. If you go to the journalism section, you'll see us right there at the top. So please, whatever you can do, $1, $2, every little bit helps, and it's greatly appreciated from me. And also just to say that the CIA and Hollywood is moving along right now. Tom and I have recorded about 3 episodes so far, and we're planning to do about 9. So we still have a couple more to go, but I think in March we'll be able to kind of knock the episodes out a little bit faster. It's been very busy for both of us right now. So, of course, definitely look out for that. We're really excited about this season. And again, if you like the work that I do and you want to hear some more, then you can always go to my website. And I hope that you will subscribe to the RSS feed. You will follow me on Twitter at PorkinsPolicy. You can also subscribe to my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/1138Porkins if you want to get all of the podcasts. And again, you can also subscribe through the email blast function. And again, if you like this work, then please do tell a friend. Listeners lately have been really, really supportive, and I appreciate that so much. But anyway, I'm going to go now, and I will be talking to you very soon.